Maxwell Stone drummed his fingers against the mahogany bar at the plaza, already regretting the words that had just left his mouth. The scotch must have gotten to his head. There was no other explanation for why he'd accept such an absurd bet. "You're really going to do it?" Derek's smirk was insufferable. "Marry the first homeless woman you meet on the street?" Max adjusted his custom-made tie, a nervous habit he developed in boarding school. "A bet's a bet. $2 million to my favorite charity if I do it, right? And if you chicken out, $2 million to mine." Derek's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Face it, Max. You've never done anything that wasn't carefully calculated. You won't go through with it." Max stood up, his 6'2" frame towering over his oldest friend. "Watch me." He grabbed his wool coat and headed for the door, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. The December air hit him like a slap to the face. Fifth Avenue glittered with holiday decorations, but Max barely noticed them as he scanned the streets. That's when he saw her. She sat on a cardboard box near Central Park South, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes. Her hands were covered in fingerless gloves as she sketched something in a tattered notebook. Max hesitated. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. But there was something about her posture, the way she held herself despite her circumstances, that made him pause. "Excuse me," he said, approaching carefully. She looked up, and Max felt his rehearsed speech die in his throat. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, clear and sharp as broken glass. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was an unmistakable intelligence in her gaze. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and steady, with traces of an accent he couldn't quite place. "This is going to sound crazy." Max started, then stopped. "How exactly does one propose to a stranger on the street? I have a proposition for you." She closed her notebook. "I'm listening." "My name is Maxwell Stone," he began, then immediately wondered why he'd used his full name, as if this were a business meeting. "I know this will sound insane, but I'd like to marry you." To his surprise, she didn't react with shock or anger. Instead, she studied him with those unnerving green eyes, her head tilted slightly. "And why would you want to do that?" she asked, as casually as if he'd offered to buy her coffee. There's a bet involved," he admitted, feeling increasingly foolish. "A substantial amount of money would go to charity." "Ah," she nodded, as if this explained everything. Rich boys and their games. Max flinched at her tone. "Look, I know it sounds terrible." "I'll do it," she said simply. "You... what?" "I said I'll do it." "When?" Max blinked, thrown off balance by her quick agreement. "You understand what I'm saying? This would be a legal marriage. There would be paperwork, a ceremony." "I understand perfectly," she replied, standing up and brushing off her worn jeans. "And I assume there's something in it for me besides the pleasure of your company?" Her sarcasm wasn't lost on him. "Of course. You'd have a place to live, financial security." He trailed off, realizing how condescending he sounded. "How generous," she said dryly. "And how long would this arrangement last?" "A year," Max said quickly. "After that we can divorce quietly. You'll get a settlement that should set you up comfortably." She extended her hand. "I'm Jane." "Just Jane?" "For now." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Shall we go meet your lawyer?" The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Max's family lawyer, Arthur Henderson, nearly had an aneurysm when Max explained the situation, but he drew up the paperwork efficiently enough. Jane provided the necessary documentation with surprising ease. Max had worried that might be an issue. They were married in a sterile courthouse ceremony, with Derek and Arthur as witnesses. Jane wore a simple blue dress that Max's housekeeper had helped her select. She'd cleaned up well, extremely well, if he was being honest. There was an elegant bone structure beneath the street grime that he hadn't noticed before. "Congratulations," Derek whispered as they signed the papers, his voice dripping with amused disbelief. "You actually did it." Max ignored him, watching Jane's steady hand as she signed her name, Jane Smith. It seemed too plain, too obvious to be real, but all her documents checked out. The drive to Max's Upper East Side townhouse was silent. Jane stared out the window, her face unreadable as the city streets rolled past. Max found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the poised woman beside him with the street artist he'd met 2 days ago. "Your home?" she asked as they pulled up to the 4-story brownstone. "Our home, technically, at least for the next year." Max led her up the steps, punching in the security code. "I had the housekeeper prepare the guest suite for you." Jane's fingertips trailed along the mahogany banister as they climbed the stairs. "How thoughtful." Keeping your charity case at arm's length? Max winced. That's not. It's fine, she cut him off. I prefer my own space anyway. Something in her tone made him pause. She moved through his home with surprising comfort, as if well-versed in such surroundings. The first few days of their arrangement settled into an unexpected rhythm. Jane kept to herself mostly, spending hours in the library or in the small garden behind the house. Max caught glimpses of her reading everything from classical literature to financial journals, but she always closed the books when he entered the room. It was during their first required public appearance, a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum, that things began to shift. Jane emerged from her room in a black evening gown that Max's sister had helped select, but it was more than the dress. She moved differently, spoke differently. Mr. and Mrs. Stone, the museum director, greeted them. We're so pleased you could join us. Jane slipped her arm through Max's with practiced ease. We wouldn't miss it. The new exhibition is extraordinary. Max nearly stumbled. Gone was the street accent, replaced by polished tones that wouldn't be out of place at a board meeting. At the bar, Derek cornered Max while Jane chatted with a group of museum patrons about Renaissance art. Something's not adding up, Derek muttered. Have you Googled her? Of course I did. Nothing came up. Max watched as Jane gracefully navigated a conversation with the museum's biggest donor. Arthur ran all the standard background checks. And that doesn't strike you as odd? A homeless woman with perfect documentation but no digital footprint? Derek shook his head. Max, people leave traces, social media, school records, something. Max frowned. His friend had a point. He'd been so focused on the absurdity of the situation, he hadn't stopped to question the easy way Jane had stepped into his world. Across the room, she laughed at something the donor said, the sound carrying clear and musical. She caught Max's eye and raised an eyebrow, as if sharing a private joke. The mystery deepened over dinner the following week. Max had insisted they maintain appearances by dining together occasionally, and Jane had agreed with that same amused smile she seemed to reserve just for him. The wine's excellent, she noted, swirling her glass with the expertise of a sommelier. Bordeaux 2015? Max set down his fork. How did you? Lucky guess. But her eyes sparkled with something that suggested it was anything but luck. Who are you? He asked finally. Your wife, remember? You made quite sure of that with all those legal documents. You know what I mean. Jane dabbed her lips with her napkin, every movement precise and practiced. Maybe you should have asked that before you married me to win a bet. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Max's mother called one morning, her voice trembling with excitement. Darling, why didn't you tell me? I just saw the society photos from the museum gala. That's Caroline Bennett. Max stepped into his study, lowering his voice. Who? Don't play dumb, Maxwell. Your wife. Caroline Bennett asked her. The banking heiress who disappeared 3 years ago after that horrible scandal with her stepfather's firm. His mother paused. Though I suppose she goes by Jane now. Max sank into his chair, memories clicking into place. The scandal had been everywhere. The young heiress who'd blown the whistle on her stepfather's Ponzi scheme, then vanished when death threats started pouring in. The papers had called her the ghost of Wall Street. I have to go, Mother, he managed, his mind racing. Through the study window, he could see Jane, Caroline, tending to the roses in the garden. Everything made sense now. Her easy grace, her knowledge of wine, the way she navigated high society. She wasn't a homeless woman who'd adapted to wealth. She was an heiress who'd adapted to the streets. Max watched her for a moment longer. She'd traded her usual worn jeans for gardening clothes, but even those looked elegant on her. When she stood up, brushing soil from her hands, she caught him staring and waved. He found himself walking outside before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The yellow roses are coming in nicely, she said, without turning around. Caroline. Her shoulders tensed, just slightly, but she didn't seem surprised. Ah, I wondered how long it would take. Were you ever going to tell me? She finally faced him, those green eyes clear and direct. Would you have believed me if I had? You could have proven it easily enough, Max said, trying to keep his voice steady. Could I? She pulled off her garden gloves. The woman who exposed a multi-billion-dollar fraud then disappeared when her stepfather's associates started making threats. The moment I surfaced, they would have found me. I could have protected you, like you protected your pride with that bet. Her words were sharp, but her tone wasn't unkind. I've learned to be careful about trusting people's promises, Maxwell. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. So why agree to this? Why risk exposure now? Because I was tired, she said simply. Tired of running? Tired of hiding? And when you showed up with your ridiculous proposition, she smiled faintly. It seemed like fate offering me a chance. A chance for what? To reclaim my life. Your name, your connections, your security. They're better protection than anything I could arrange on my own. She touched a rose petal gently. And the irony was too perfect to resist. The wealthy playboy making a bet to marry a homeless woman, only to end up with exactly the kind of wife his family would have chosen for him anyway. Max found himself laughing despite everything. You planned this from the beginning? Not exactly. But I knew who you were the moment you approached me. The Maxwell Stone, heir to Stone Industries. Your face has been in enough financial magazines. Her expression grew serious. I took a calculated risk. If you turned out to be like my stepfather, I could disappear again. But if you were different. And what's your verdict so far? You're not as clever as you think you are, she said, a hint of warmth in her voice. But you're kinder than you pretend to be. I watched you tip that hot dog vendor triple his asking price last week, and you've been secretly funding that homeless shelter on 42nd Street. Max shifted uncomfortably. How did you... I have my sources. Old habits die hard. She stepped closer. The question is, what are you going to do now that you know? That depends, he said slowly. Are you still planning to disappear after our year is up? I hadn't decided. She studied his face. Though I admit, these past few weeks haven't been entirely unpleasant. High praise indeed, Max said dryly, but his heart was racing. Your stepfather's still in prison, you know. 5 more years minimum. His friends aren't, Caroline replied. The ones who were never charged, who still control enough money and influence to make my life very difficult. She paused. Or to damage Stone Industries if they discovered the connection. Let them try. The words came out fiercer than Max intended. My company's clean. We can weather any storm they stir up. You sound very sure. I am sure. And I have some influence of my own. He met her gaze steadily. Stay. Not because of our arrangement, but because you want to. We can figure out the rest together. She was quiet for a long moment, absently touching the wedding ring she'd been wearing as part of their charade. You do realize this isn't a romance novel, don't you? Real life is messier than that. I'm counting on it, Max said. Makes things more interesting. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. You're still angry about being deceived. Of course I am, Max admitted. But I'm also impressed and intrigued. Not many people can outmaneuver me. Is that what this is about? The challenge? No. He stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of roses from her gardening. It's about the woman who spends hours reading in my library but always hides the books when I come in. Who can discuss Renaissance art with billionaire donors but chooses to sketch in the park? Who had every reason to be bitter but still helps that elderly neighbor with her groceries when she thinks no one's watching? Caroline's breath caught slightly. You notice that? I notice a lot of things, particularly about you. Well, she said softly, your observation skills have certainly improved since the day you proposed to a random woman on the street. In my defense, you weren't exactly random. No, she agreed. I wasn't. She glanced at the roses she'd been tending. You know what I miss most about my old life? The greenhouse at our summer house. I used to spend hours there. We could build one, Max said. There's plenty of space in the back garden. We? She raised an eyebrow. You're that certain about this? I'm certain that I want to find out who Caroline Bennett really is. No masks, no games. He held out his hand. Partners? She looked at his offered hand, then back at his face. You do realize you've already won your bet? The bet stopped mattering weeks ago, Max said. Somewhere between watching you read Jane Austen at midnight and hearing you hum Mozart while making coffee. I'm a terrible cook, she warned. All those years of personal chefs. I noticed. That attempt at scrambled eggs last week was... He trailed off at her expression. Was what exactly? But her eyes were dancing with suppressed laughter. Was a unique culinary experience, he finished diplomatically. Besides, I'm not exactly a master chef myself. We can learn together. You're serious about this. It wasn't a question. Dead serious. Though I should warn you, if you stay, my mother will be impossible. She already called this morning, beside herself with excitement about Caroline Bennett Astor being her daughter-in-law. Caroline groaned. I suppose I'll have to make some public appearances once word gets out. Release a statement. We'll handle it together. Max touched her cheek gently. But first, I think you owe me a real first date. One where we both know who we're having dinner with. She pretended to consider it. I suppose I could pencil you in, though technically we're already married. Minor detail. He grinned. Think of it as doing things backwards. Marriage first, dating second, falling in. He stopped himself. Falling in what? She asked softly. Instead of answering, he kissed her. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling. Well, she said, slightly breathless, I suppose backwards isn't so bad. 3 years later, Max and Caroline stood in their greenhouse, surrounded by blooming roses. The scandal of her return had faded into yesterday's news, her stepfather's threats neutralized by the combined power of the Stone and Bennett fortunes. Remember when you thought I was just a homeless artist? She asked, cutting fresh roses for the dinner table. Remember when you thought I was just a spoiled rich boy making ridiculous bets? You were a spoiled rich boy making ridiculous bets, she pointed out. True. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. But it turned out to be the best I ever made. Caroline turned in his embrace. We're both different people now. Better people, he agreed, kissing her softly. Outside, snow began to fall on Fifth Avenue, but in their greenhouse, surrounded by roses, spring was eternal.